We're following some breaking news out of the United Kingdom. After less than 2 months on the job, Prime Minister Liz Truss is stepping down. She made an incredibly brief statement announcing her resignation this morning. Listen.
Given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party. This morning I met the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week.
So Ramy Inocencio is joining us outside of 10 Downing Street in London to talk a little bit more about this political chaos. For such a seismic announcement, it was short and sweet. And to the point. Is there a phrase to be economical with your words?
Yeah.
The irony being that, you know, her plan for the economy is part of her undoing. What changed between Truss's statement last night and when she said just yesterday that she was not a quitter?
Sure. The realization that she can't carry on and that the snowball effect of people submitting letters of no confidence to what she just referenced, the 1922 committee. This is the committee that basically chooses and changes rules for the party's leader. When she met with Sir Graham Brady, there was something there that basically made her realize that she can't continue. Now, this is a massive change from just hours ago overnight when she and her allies were trying to, in effect, corral her own party members to vote for her in a kind of confidence vote in a bill that was massively unrelated, actually, to this, to a bill about fracking for shale gas. Now that this is totally changed overnight in just the past few minutes. The big question is, how did we get here? We got here from basically a series of policy missteps, economically, financially, as you just mentioned, that caused the markets to freak out. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the finance minister, was sacked, the fall guy for that, but that still wasn't enough to calm nerves. And then the Interior Secretary yesterday resigned also, scathing criticism there. So basically we've seen this falling apart, the wheels coming off of the Truss car over the past few weeks, but really in effect starting from when she first got the keys to 10 Downing.
You know, Ramy, I was struck by a statistic that I saw earlier this morning or maybe last night that before Brexit, the United Kingdom had 4 prime ministers over 31 years. And since Brexit, Britain has had 4 prime ministers over 7 years. So there's been a lot of change over the course of the last couple of years, especially since Brexit. The question on everybody's mind, what is the future of the Conservative Party?
Oh, yeah. And just to add to your point, Vlad, in the next week, we may actually have a 5th prime minister in the past 7 years, because that is what Liz Truss has told us, that within the next week there will be a new leadership election. In terms of the future of the Conservative Party, let's say, put it this way, if there was a general election that includes the whole entire British electorate, according to polls, if that happened now, the Conservative Party would be lost to the political wilderness because the Labour Party would just win in a massive, massive landslide. But before we get to that, we do have to get to the Conservative Party election. There are some people who are already saying that they will actually not stand for election, including the new finance minister, Jeremy Hunt, who is only in the role just for the past couple of days. But with that said, there is no shortage of other people who have already made their ambitions known in the last election, which just happened a few months ago. So we should expect those people to come back to the forefront.
You know, Vlad pointed out that the number of prime ministers, many of them have been Tory prime ministers.
Right.
They've been conservatives. And so, you know, it's perhaps not a complete surprise that the current finance minister may not want to run, because whoever takes over this role is taking over, you know, a number of headaches. Clearly, the Tory party needs to be sort of disciplined, and that's going to be one headache. But there is, of course, the economy, which essentially is what cost her, you know, Liz Truss her job, the economy post-pandemic, and what the economy looks post-Brexit, because it's the Tory party that was successful in pushing Brexit through. But now, post-Brexit, we're not quite sure what things are going to look like.
Absolutely right. And even though the Conservative Party pushed Brexit and Boris Johnson famously said that he got it done, living here in the UK, there are still many people who are angry about Brexit. There are still many people around London who are holding signs to say that they want Brexit to come undone. But in terms of the meat and potato issues, as it were, for the British electorate, it does come down to the cost of living. The most recent inflation number for September came in at just over 10% for the month, and that is a 40-year high. So people are wondering how they're going to afford electricity, how they're going to afford food, how they're just basically going to live moving forward. And that is basically what put Truss under the bus and now has her out at Downing.
So, Ramy, I know you probably, this news is just breaking now, and you're getting the information as we learn it, but I wonder who are some of the names that have been sort of bandied about as who could potentially become the next PM?
Sure. We've only heard one person who will not stand for the Conservative Party election. That is Jeremy Hunt, the finance minister. But there are many people who have already said that they are ambitious, who have translated that over the past few months in the last election. Rishi Sunak comes to mind. He's the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the former finance minister under Boris Johnson. He actually lost to Truss in the last election. We wouldn't be surprised if he tried to have a go again at that. With that said, there is a YouGov poll that puts him at a favorability rating of 23%. And that YouGov poll also found that there's one person actually higher than that. I find myself smiling, I guess, when I say this, because Boris Johnson is a name who comes higher than Rishi Sunak.
Wow.
It's a question of whether Boris Johnson wants to come back, will come back. He came in at 32%, but a lot of people probably, put it this way, when Truss was elected, a lot of people actually didn't want Boris to go to begin with. So there is a logic here that potentially we could see Boris Johnson return, and there is no rule or policy that says that he can't. There are other people also out there. Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, Suella Braverman, who was the Interior Secretary, who just resigned yesterday. She was actually the first person to put her name out there for the last election. So there are a lot of ambitious people. We're going to know the names soon.
You know, to sort of put what you just said a little bit in context, and for an American audience to understand the parliamentary system, that the next leader of the Tory party will be chosen by Tory party members, rank and file Tory party members, not people in parliament, but other people. And they are, Ramy, as you know, overwhelmingly male, white, do not live in cities, and probably more conservative leaning, which would explain why, you know, someone who campaigns on sort of conservative ideals and pro-Brexit ideals would find themselves in the prime minister's seat, but not necessarily successful in the general election.
Absolutely. The demographic that you just described is the demographic that is actually not so much in the Houses of Parliament. It is a very clear distinction between those voting members on the order of 12 to 15,000 or so. It changes depending on each year or so and the numbers there. But those people, as you say, are mostly not in the cities. They prefer to be a little bit more protective about the country, if you will, even more conservative when it comes to finances, when it comes to tax cuts, when it comes to keeping their money. But the people here in Parliament, the conservative lawmakers here, they are looking at it from the mainstream for electability, right? Against a potential Labour opposition leader in some general election. Now, it has been now known to us that Liz Truss will not stand in that future general election, even though just maybe an hour ago, her spokesperson said that she still would.
Wow.
It remains to be seen whether the Conservative Party can find someone who can perhaps not tack to the right, but maybe tack to the middle. Again, there is this civil war, if you will, between the legislators here, the conservative legislators here, and the conservative voters across the country.
So, you know, Ramy, I'm always looking at what our audience is saying while we're broadcasting on the air. And a lot of people, as Anne-Marie pointed out, here in this country really don't understand this parliamentary system.
Yeah.
They don't understand when they hear and they see things like the 1922 committee and the role that the 1922 committee plays in selecting the party leader. They don't understand that. Certainly they can understand why perhaps her tax cuts that she proposed did not go down very well with most Britons, and it caused a collapse, or at least a very, very dramatic day in the stock market. But just give our viewers an understanding of why this matters to them. People are worried about inflation here. They're worried about the midterm elections coming up in 3 weeks. What's the significance of this broadly?
Sure. Well, to your first part of that question, the 1922 committee is important because it does lay the rules. It lays the framework for choosing the party leader and choosing how the mechanism actually happens for that. It's important in this case because the legislators, the Conservative Party legislators who sent in their letters of no confidence actually sent them to the 1922 committee and the head of that, Sir Graham Brady. And so even in the past day, it's happening so quickly, the number of legislators who have sent in those letters of no confidence has actually doubled from, I believe 15 is the latest count that I saw. And these are people who are saying, listen, our constituents are telling us that the direction of the government, the direction of Liz Truss, is not dovetailing with what our constituents want, with what our constituents want in terms of economic policy, we discussed earlier, in terms of inflation, energy prices, and that is what hits home with all of these current legislators who have put in their votes of no confidence. And let's be frank, if Liz Truss did try to stay in power another day, we very likely would have seen even more votes of no confidence. So Liz Truss probably saw the writing on the wall now and said, now it's time to pull the plug.
So in terms of a future timeline for a possible general election, I'm sure there's some sort of guidance on that. What's kind of like the over under, more than a year, less than a year? What is it looking like?
Sure. Well, Liz Truss in her own statement said that we're going to have an election in the next week, which is massively fast. The last election that brought Liz Truss to power was on the order of about 7 weeks or so, and that happened through the culling of different levels of people based on how many votes they got at certain levels, certain chapters, certain echelons in that time frame.
So, but what about
we know now,
sorry,
the basic level right now.
So what about in terms of a general election, though? Once someone is chosen to replace her, when could the UK be looking at a general election?
Sure, absolutely. Right now, the Conservative Party is in control of when the general election needs to happen. Now, that could happen anytime between now and the end of 2024, but it doesn't have to happen until the end of that timeline. There is no reason, obviously now, for the Conservative Party to call an election, because if they did, they would lose in avalanche. So what needs to happen now for the Conservative Party is they need to get their act together, to get their house in order, to find the trust in the people again in order for them to vote for them. But this is a high bar, and people will say that it's not just something that happened with Liz Truss. It has been something that has been on the downslide in the final years of Boris Johnson. And even before that, there are analysts who have been saying that the Conservative Party has just been in power for far too long, and they have lost the unity, the cohesion from being in power for that long. And of course, Labour, the opposition, is now taking advantage of that and saying, we are now the government in waiting, and the Conservatives are now the opposition in waiting.
So
sorry.
I was going to say, Ramy sort of touched on something that I was kind of thinking about. For us on this side of the pond, as Vlad sort of alluded to, it's a bit of a spectator sport, right? Watching what's happening in Parliament. But it's not for the people living there. And I was curious about the general feeling about their politicians, not necessarily the two parties. I know here in this country there is a lot of lack of trust in what politicians say versus what they do. What is the general feeling there?
Sure. The word comes to mind is tired. When we talk about politicians on both sides, I believe that there's a pause, there's maybe a sigh, and there is an internal, if not an external, eye roll. And it just so happens that the Conservative Party is getting the brunt of that because they are in power. But even before the current opposition leader, Keir Starmer, came to power, Jeremy Corbyn before, a lot of people were saying that it was his election to lose, but he just couldn't get enough people to get around him. So it's not so much that just the Conservatives, according to many, are not doing very well, but it was also Labour's inability to capitalize on that. And so this country, just like the United States, like many other countries, is so vastly polarized. People are set in their ways. And looking ahead, it feels very much like the United States, basically, that there's just a small little middle ground and there's very little movement either way. And even if people wanted to lie, if people wanted to come back on their promises, the electorate, or at least the people who are the steadfast loyalists, will still vote for those politicians regardless of what they say or do.
So one thing, Ramy, again, trying to put this in context for an American audience who might be focused on other things, you know, most people don't understand what's not similar to the United States is when a leader, in this case the Prime Minister, proposes a policy which leads to the turmoil that we're witnessing this morning. So as you know, on Wednesday, there was this vote on whether to ban hydraulic fracking, which erupted like it looked like a melee there. We were talking about it yesterday, Anne-Marie, and the accusations were that there were some ministers who sort of manhandled the Tory lawmakers, and threatened them with retribution if they didn't vote to support the Prime Minister.
Well, it was so much more than a vote on fracking.
There's an underlying current there, which is what I'm hoping Ramy will be able to understand. But this accusation that the cabinet members were bullying the conservative lawmakers, and for a lot of Americans are like, well, wow, if there's a leader who can go down just because they propose something that a cabinet doesn't agree with, explain that to me.
Sure. Well, in talking with what happened last night at Parliament, I believe that there was a sense of desperation in order to try to get people to vote for that bill on fracking, which really was not so much a vote on fracking, but was a vote of confidence or no confidence in the Prime Minister. And I think that desperation was telegraphed through television, as well as through the lawmakers who actually were pushed, were shoved, were manhandled. Reports of at least one lawmaker even crying in the lobby, wondering how the Conservative Party actually got to this point. But this is just a testament to the disarray, the dysfunction of what's happening in the British government now. And I think to Anne-Marie's question earlier is that people are just at a loss as to how to think, what to believe, whether the government itself can come back from this, whether it's a government that can serve the people or would serve the interests of the politicians here. One of the Conservative politicians earlier last night basically was pointing the finger at his own party members, at the people who voted for Liz Truss, and said, listen, I hope you are happy with what you've done in terms of what you did for yourself. If you wanted a seat at the table, if you wanted to become a minister, sure, you got it. If you thought that you could attach your coattails, coattails to Liz Truss, sure, you got that. But look, now she's gone down, and now you're going down with it, and now the country potentially is going down with it too.
Wow.
All right, Ramy Inocencio, and I know, Ramy, it looks very calm where you are, and the live shot from number 10 Downing Street always looks calm because you got the door behind you there. But I'm sure if your cameraman were to pan and show us the scene that, as you see it, it would be one of dozens, if not, multiple dozens of cameras and perhaps even people.
You should put a picture on IG.
Yeah, you should definitely show us on your Instagram later on what the scene looks like.
Absolutely. The correspondent's right next to me. You might be hearing them. But actually, I will add that just down the street through the gates at 10 Downing Street, when Liz Truss resigned, there was a massive explosion of applause.
Wow.
People were ready for this.
Wow.
All right. Ramy Inocencio for us right in front of number 10 Downing Street. As always, Ramy, we so appreciate it. Thank you very much.